In this video, we're going to be looking at the making of America, topic 1, which is America's expansion. So before we get started, here's a key of what you might see in this video. Highlighted in red are your second order concepts, which are really important if you want to get the highest grades. The green highlights are very important people to remember, so people who crop up quite a lot in the exams. They're people who you can write a lot about quite often. So the first thing you need to know about the USA is how and why it expanded from these dates here. The thing about how America expanded was quite ironic because the USA was apparently democratic, which means that everyone should be allowed to vote, but only white property owning men could vote, which meant it wasn't really much of a democracy if not everyone had the right to vote. So between 1776 and 1783, the USA fought for independence and won. It then chose not to have a royal family, so was called a republic. So instead of a king governing the country, it had a constitution, which is basically a list of laws that decides how the country is run. So the USA was a federal country, and this means that some laws every single state had to abide by, but some state governors could make their own laws within that state. So as you probably know, the USA is split into states with their own government, which is run by a state governor, which is like an MP. The state governor can make their own laws, but it has to abide by the Constitution because it's a federal country. If enough people in Congress, which is like Parliament, agreed to change the Constitution, an amendment could be made to it. So we have stuff like the Second Amendment, the 13th Amendment is a big one. If there was land which had too few people to have a state governor, that land would be directly controlled by Congress. There were 13 original states when America was founded. This is a weird little acronym to remember it. I'm not going to write down all the states because you obviously know that already. But slavery was a huge role in the expansion of America because between 1790 and 1838, the number of states doubled. So the reasons why the USA grew so rapidly was because one of the early presidents, called Thomas Jefferson, opened the Northwest and Southwest Territories. This meant that cotton production in the South was increased and production of cotton products in the North was increased because of these territories that were opened. As well as this, in 1803, America bought a huge plot of land in Louisiana from the French, which meant that there was more area for settlement and plantations. The slaveholders were eager to expand their plantations in the South because they would have earned more money and power if they had more slaves coming in. Another reason why the USA grew so rapidly was because many presidents, and early presidents like George Washington, would fight with Indians and take their lands. So here's our first second order concept, the consequences of the country's growth. The only consequence really was a ton of conflict between all types of people. Obviously, there was conflict between white people and Indians because the white people forced the Indians to move west, which obviously they weren't happy with, but we'll talk more about that later. There was conflict between white Northerners and white Southerners. The North feared that the South were being too powerful, and the South feared that the North were too greedy. There's conflict between abolitionists, which were people who didn't like slavery for whatever reason, and slaveholders, because some people thought that slavery was morally wrong. So the next subtopic, the expansion of southern cotton plantations and slavery, 1793 to 1838. One of the most important reasons for why America is so rich today is because of the cotton industry, which provided such a strong economy in both the North and the South, because cotton would be grown in the South through slavery. It would then be exported to the North, where cotton products would be made. As well as this, in 1790, the Deep South, which is an area in the South, was opened up for settlement, which meant that more slaveholders could open up plantations on that land and earn more money. The reason why slavery grew so quickly was because the children of slaves were automatically slaves. They had no choice. Obviously, the new land, cotton, in 1790, because of the Deep South, meant that more plantations could be opened. A lot of the presidents were from the South, so they weren't abolitionists, and they probably owned slaves before that, so there's no way that slavery would be ruled out if they were in charge. Another key term to remember is that banks would loan their money to plantation owners as long as they repaid that loan with interest, but once the law's on your side, slavery has no limits then. In 1739, the cotton gin was invented by Eli Whitney, and that helped to process cotton 50 times faster, but it also meant that more slaves would be needed to actually work the cotton gin. So it was good for boosting the economy, but really horrible for humanity, obviously. So another second order concept are the consequences of slavery, which is mostly about tension. So the North were really worried that the South were getting too powerful, because with the addition of the Deep South and new settlement areas in the South, slavery was growing like there's no tomorrow. And the South and the North were worried that they were getting too powerful and getting too rich. There was a small number of people who thought slavery was morally wrong, but they didn't amount to a huge part of the population. But the biggest reason for why there was tension around slavery was because there was a worry that the balance of power between the North and the South, the slave and the free, would be disrupted if a new free or slave state was added. So that basically means that if a free state, which is a northern state, was added, that might mean that they become more powerful than the southern states, which would have been slave states, and vice versa. So to resolve all of these issues, the Missouri Compromise was made, and we'll look about that in the next slide. So the Missouri Compromise was a law that was made that drew a virtual line across the country, so it split it in half horizontally. So, and if a new state was added in the western area of America, it had to be either a free or slave state, depending on which side it was on. So if it was higher up in the western area, if it was northwest, it would have to be a free state. But if it was further down, lower in the half, it had to be a slave state. All territories were free unless they joined the South. And the important thing you should remember, if you remember anything about the Missouri Compromise, is that there was a new system of adding states. So for every slave state that was added, a free one also had to be added, to keep that balance of power and make sure it's not disturbed. So next subtopic, the removal of indigenous people from the East, 1830 to 1838. It's really important you remember your dates. So there were 5 civilized tribes that you need to know about, and it's best to remember 3 in case you're asked about any of them in like a 1-mark question. These are your 5 civilized tribes over here. They're called civilized tribes because those were the tribes that tried to adopt a white American way of living. They discovered America before white settlers, so they were the first ones there. But however, because of this, well, not because of that, they were treated as inferior unjustly, so they felt the need to adapt to a European way of living once the white settlers came and disturbed their peace. An example of this would be the Cherokee tribe, used the same political structures as the USA. They even made a new language and a newspaper and opened new churches. So the removal of Indians from the East is a really important topic. It's best that you spend a lot of time on this slide. So in 1830, a really horrible president called Andrew Jackson was elected. He was a classic Southern slave owner, hated indigenous people, loved slavery, that kind of man. He persuaded Congress, remember the Parliament, to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act basically is a description of what it was. It was an act which removed Indians from the east to the west. He set up poor, destitute areas called Indian territories west of the Mississippi River, so away from the east for the Indians to live in. Consequences of the Indian Removal Act was a lot of disruption to the Indians' peace, a lot of conflict and tension, and rightly so. So the Choctaw and Chickasaw, they didn't want any trouble. They cooperated really quickly. They gave up land, they signed the treaty, no problem. However, a lot of them died due to lack of government funding and harsh winters whilst travelling over to the west. So even compliance didn't get you anywhere. The Cherokee weren't having any of this, so they took their case to the Supreme Court, which is like the Crown Court in England, in 1832, and they won. So they were allowed to stay in Georgia, which is where they were before, and Andrew Jackson and the white settlers had no right to take that away from them because it was in law now. The Creek just refused to sign altogether. But obviously this wasn't going to sit well with the white settlers if the Cherokee and the Creek were refusing to move. So the Seminole signed a treaty in 1830 to move west. Some of them did, but not all of them agreed to sign, and so not all of them went. Some of them went west, some of them stayed. So to make sure that all of the Seminole had moved west, the US Army captured and killed their leader, who was called Osceola. He is a really important guy. And because they killed their leader, the Seminole were forced to move west because they had no one else to govern them. The Creek didn't want to move places, but they did sign a treaty in 1832 to give up some land. However, this was quite limited, another second-order concept, because white people moved on to land that had not been given to them, so they were trespassing. As a result, the Creeks attacked the white army, meaning the Creeks were forcibly removed by the US Army because they were acting so... Well, in my opinion, they had the right because the white settlers were moving onto land that they had not been gifted. But they were still punished for it, the Creeks. The Cherokee obviously took their case to the Supreme Court in Georgia, and they won, but this law was limited again because the US Army was sent to Georgia to send the Cherokee into concentration camps. After this, they were forced to march to the Indian territories on the Trail of Tears, which took place in 1838. It's called the Trail of Tears because of how tearful it was. It was a very hard trail full of tears. I don't really know how else to explain it. It was just a really hard path to take to their new territories. And that's the end of topic 1. It's not really that much content if you break it up like this. If you keep going over these slides, it will quickly get into your head. There's also a link to a set of Quizlet decks that I made, where if you want all of these slides into a set of online flashcards, which really do help with active recall. The next video is going to be topic 2, which I can't remember what it's called. But if you want to see that video, the link will be down below.